Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored. I was honored to be asked to give this lecture. I love Warsaw. I've only been here 2 days, but I want to come back. I love Warsaw University. I like the campus. It reminds me of the gate. Your gate is like our gate, Samuel's gates. Got a lot in common with Indiana University. I've developed a habit over many years of speaking without a microphone in case in the middle of a lecture there was a thunderstorm and the power went and I wasn't able to communicate. So I have a feeling, in fact, this is a great sized room for this endeavor. So let's go and let's move back in time. As you've already been told, I'm interested more in the way wars have been remembered in various nations than in the particular wars themselves, which of course are fairly interesting, but the battles on the ground last for a few short years. The battles about how to remember the wars never end. And so as a historian, your subject is inexhaustible, and you can go on forever studying it and listening and looking at the debates. So I want to basically do 3 things this afternoon. I want to tell you a little bit about how America came to see World War II as a good war. More interesting to me, I want to tell you a little bit about how Americans understood the war before it was a good war, with all the sort of celebration of the late 20th century. And as I put some thoughts together, I couldn't help but thinking about the Holocaust, which IU delegation has had a chance to talk about already today, certainly being here in Poland. And I wanted to look at the way Americans came to understand the Holocaust, because the framework that we imposed on World War II to kind of an understanding of it very much affected how Americans understood the Holocaust as well. If you think that it was simple, and if you think that it was straightforward, I can tell you it wasn't. And if it was, it wouldn't be as interesting to study. So, those are a group of American veterans at Normandy in DDay celebrations. The DDay celebrations have been very important to the way Americans remember World War II. Those gentlemen have certainly proudly served their country and fought in World War II. They are today in the United States, as many of you know, called or referred to not as simply veterans or soldiers or even heroes, but the greatest generation. I don't know if it's something about America that thinks that what it does is the greatest, but here the correlation between the good war and the greatest generation tells you a great deal about the way we've come to understand the war within the U.S. And just by the terms good and greatest, you get an indication that, in fact, our view is highly mythical. Mythical in the sense that it's not long, just mythical in the sense that it is shortened. It is abbreviated to enhance or emphasize certain particular descriptions, like the good war, and to omit or lead, if you will, certain other perspectives on the war itself. D-Day is very important to the creation of a story that World War II was the good war in America, because it was D-Day, from the American perspective, that landed the great Allied Army on the beaches, fought the Germans, fought their way to Germany, and liberated the camps, and helped bring about the destruction, of course, of the Nazi regime. So certainly a virtuous story, a good story, a powerful story. It is very important to understand, in the context of American memory of the war, that D-Day has always been important than stories about the Pacific War, about the war against the Japanese. I won't get into that a little bit right now, but in fact, there you get into more questionable discussions about what we did or didn't do, whereas opposed to the sort of defeat of Hitler and the liberation of the camps, which of course enhances anyone's role, the Russians as well as the Americans, in bringing about that particular defeat. Those of you who read the papers recently know that President Obama was just in Hiroshima. He had to be very careful what he said. He wasn't able to basically offer any sort of apologies for the atomic bombings, for example, because that's still a very sore subject. And so if you're going to get the good war at its best, you're going to get the D-Day invasion and the march to Germany. You're going to get less of the savage and what many people feel is the more racist war in the Pacific. So the Greatest Generation is often used in American culture today as moral paradigms. They are inherently virtuous, they're inherently patriotic, they love their country, in effect, they're sort of not complex human beings. They are, in a sense, mythical people who are described in these particular terms. And in that very recent cartoon, the World War II veteran, of course, is sort of chastising a younger protester in the U.S. Who's protesting the 99%. Of course, the 99% are those who are not among the 1% or the most wealthiest. That's the Bernie Sanders campaign, if you're following the American election, etc. So that, in fact, it's interesting that that sort of depiction of the war versus the younger generation is critical of a protest against inequality. And that is more suggestive of what we're about to say than I could possibly imagine, and you might not be able to imagine. And I certainly didn't imagine when I stumbled across that particular cartoon. So I'm going to go back in time. I tell undergraduates all the time, no one reads Norman Mailer anymore, and in part because his great World War II novel, The Naked and the Dead, was 800 pages. And so it's not the easiest thing in the world to get an undergraduate to sit down and read 800 pages, but there are those who actually will do it and will do a pretty good job. But when you think about the fact that Mailer was a vet, fought in the Pacific, he was at Nagasaki after the second atomic bomb, about 6 weeks after that, writes what he thinks is the great American novel. His novel about the World War II is anything but a good war, or it's anything about a heroic perspective on the individuals who fought. Some of the sort of points I make up there, for Mailer, there's no doubt. The war against Hitler was absolutely necessary and totally a good war and virtuous, necessary sacrifice. In the Pacific, he felt just the opposite, that in fact, that was more, in Mailer's perspective, an exercise for the Americans in trying to establishing their hegemony or their power within the Pacific, etc. And so his whole book is about basically his amazement as a soldier, fictitious soldiers in the book, that are amazed at how far the Americans will go to defeat their enemies. In other words, the extent of their violence. In fact, it's a book that really is less about World War II, and it's more about the sort of violent nature of American society. And if you time to dissect it, but Mailer basically asks the question, where do we get this capacity for violence, as opposed to just simply heroic deeds? And his basically answer is it's a competitive society, combat, justice, etc. And I know the values of the free market, but he had a certainly different take on that, and a very critical use of our violence, and a very sort of critical perspective on the war itself. The comment century, the comment century of the right, if you lived in the 1940s, you would know what that had meant, maybe some people anyhow. And the century of the right, that was basically the conservatives. They saw the future after the war as a nation of the world that would be dominated by powerful men. And the century of the common man was the democratic dream of the mid-20th century, where in fact, because we made this sacrifice, we would have a more egalitarian and democratic society today. That was a fierce debate then. In the celebration of the good war today, we don't get the connection between our fight in World War II and the fact that it was primarily to create a more egalitarian society. We get celebration of our virtue, celebration of the defeat of evil people in the world, the liberation of the camps, but we sort of put to the back burner the sort of democratic aspirations were really at the heart of what Roosevelt was saying, and many people were believing is why we had to make the sacrifices we did in the 1940s. What would I have here? So those are comments that people who read Mailer's book in the 40s sent to Mailer. I mean, those are people living in the 1940s, and what are they saying? They're writing the letters. You can read a lot of these. There's a lot of letters to Mailer. They're archived down in Texas, but he said, look, some people said, look, the war and the novel showed that the frailties of human nature. There was a big debate after World War II about the violent temper of human nature, of all human beings, etc. That, of course, is an interesting discussion because it sort of tempers any attempt to make one particular group of people more heroic or virtuous than another. Again, they're talking about the urge to kill as a dominant American and human instinct, that our civilized behavior finds its great expression in war, which is sort of a cynical comment. And from the New York Times book review of Mailer's novel in 1948, it says the book doesn't show us that it was a good war. It talks about, which is actually an interesting terminology, the choppy waters of disillusionment. Now, we're glad we win, but wow, look what it showed. Look how violent it showed people could be. Look how violent it showed that we could be. I mean, what do you take from the atomic bomb and the Holocaust? Simply that there were winners and losers? Or do you make the more universal assumptions and et cetera, point that in fact the world ahead may not be the world of the common man or the powerful man, but a world dominated by violence, and maybe prophetic in many ways. That's not me saying that. Those are people writing to Mailer after they read his book. James Jones was another veteran. Every novelist I'm talking about here is a veteran of the war. He suffered from PTSD. He had, for him, a horrific experience of killing a Japanese soldier, finding a letter on the dead body that was, somebody translated for him, a statement about how he missed his family, he wanted to write this letter back, wanted to send this letter back to the family. And certainly that experience humanizes the Japanese enemies, which are often considered savages. And so that sort of contributes, as Jones told the story, to his PTSD. There was no definition of post-traumatic stress disorder in World War II. That's something that comes later, but in fact that's retrospective. We know what he had. And he wrote 3 novels. I obviously can't go into all of this, but his novels, From Here to Eternity, they made a movie. It's about the violence within the military itself, the competitiveness, the thin red line, meditation, how war transforms us into violent human beings. And of course, by assumption, if war transforms us into violent people, then it's a little harder to say it simply makes us heroic, although it can do that as well. And Whistle, which is his novel published after he died, basically is set in an army hospital, and it's filled with sick soldiers back with their wounds. There's a great passage or a scene in Whistle where the army doctor wants to cut off a veteran's leg, and the veteran wants to gather all his comrades to take a vote. In other words, he doesn't trust authority, he wants this medical decision. Jones is really great in terms of being cynical. He wants a medical decision based on sort of a democratic process and not even the authority of a medical practitioner. So these veterans are not looking at the war in any particular way. I probably have more slides that I can get through, and I won't go on forever, but before there was a good war, the way that Americans mostly understood World War II was through the prism or the framework of what was known as the Popular Front. Today we talk about globalization and technology as sort of reigning paradigms that are altering and sweeping our world. And so they are. If there was at least one reigning paradigm or framework that Americans talked about widely, this was the only way they talked about it, in the 40s, it was the Popular Front. The Popular Front was a sort of vague collection of ideas that a lot of people adhered to. Its most important political manifestation was Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, government working to ensure the economic betterment of the people, activist government, I would agree with that today, etc. But the Popular Front was more than that. It was a bunch of artists, and writers, and activists who were out in the streets agitating for labor unions. They were creating plays, they were writing music, they were using mass culture actually in really interesting ways to make or promote democratic messages. And if you asked a lot of Americans in World War II why they thought they were fighting, not everybody, everybody, etc., probably the most common explanation would be that they were fighting because, in fact, they thought that they would get, or we would create a better world, or the terminology at the time, one world. A world that was more united, and a world that was articulated in Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, where men and women everywhere, and that's the language they used at the time, would have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And if you really sort of unpack what Roosevelt is saying, and Americans who are adhering to the Popular Front are saying when they say we're fighting so we can have freedom from want, one of the things they're really high on is to have a right to a job and healthcare. I defy anybody to go to the United States in the last 20 years and find anybody who talked about World War II, the greatest generation, good war, and say that it was in part to give us healthcare. That would start a mini riot in the U.S. today. I mean, but that's what people thought they were doing. So it was a less mythical time, but it was a more hopeful time in terms of trying to frame the war in much of what Roosevelt and the Popular Front was about. So, you want a Popular Front hero? I could have put up 20 slides. I could have played you Frank Sinatra music. There's so much more I could do. I don't have that much time. But hey, Joe Louis was a Popular Front hero. He was the world champ. He was drafted into the Army. In fact, Louis was upset. He wanted to fight. But in fact, the Army wanted Louis to go meet the troops because everybody wanted to meet the champ, etc. And Louis was not only a sort of a patriotic figure, having beat a German champ in the late 30s, sort of gets a lot of credit for that, but Louis, of course, is part of another sort of dream that was part of the Popular Front, and that was an America and a world grounded much more in racial equality. I mean, when we talk about the good war, the greatest generation today, we not only forget the healthcare, we not only forget the democratic promises of equality, etc., but we forget how much that sort of rhetoric, that political rhetoric, was about racial equality and racial topics. Now, that doesn't mean that was all ensured, although, and this is another lecture for another time, you basically probably have to argue that if you're going to study the modern civil rights movement in America, that you have to start with World War II. And that's, again, hours and hours and hours of what that would mean. So Louis embodies not only the democratic promise during the patriotic stuff, but in fact, the idea, now, was everybody going to change their racial attitudes overnight? Of course not. But it was part of the way we were framing the war, and part of the way many of the people at that time, or what they thought the war was about. So the Popular Front begins to sort of erode as a major force of political thought connected to the war once we hit the early 1950s. And the Cold War, which so affected Poland, also, of course, affected the United States. Obviously, we jumped lock, stock, and barrel into the Cold War, especially after 1949, when the Russians get the atomic bomb. We thought we were safe for a while. We've got the bomb. They don't. All of a sudden, Stalin's got the bomb. The Cold War's on, and that is going to move us in a different political direction. Senator Joseph McCarthy is famous in American history for McCarthyism. McCarthyism is not about tolerance. McCarthyism is not about democracy. McCarthyism is about finding stuff on you and condemning you, criticizing you, ridiculing you, if you somehow or not seem to be a true Cold Warrior. And a true Cold Warrior is someone who is unquestionably patriotic, but not unquestionably supportive of democratic principles. The note I have, the U.S. fails to adopt the Declaration of Human Rights. 1948, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it takes the United States, the nation that was ostensibly fighting a war for the four freedoms and for this democratic dream of the Popular Front. It takes the United States 40 years to ratify the UN Declaration of Human Rights. You would think that being out front in terms of the war and its democratic aspirations, that would have been a no-brainer. But in fact, the more we got into the Cold War, the more we were retreating from some of those democratic principles. We were reluctant to ratify the UN Declaration of Human Rights for several reasons. One, in fact, we didn't want the United Nations imposing on our ability and flexibility to conduct our foreign policies and do whatever we needed to do in the world. And secondly, there was a lot of turmoil within the construction of the UN Declaration because there was concern that calls for racial justice would be used more than in the American South, especially than many of the congressmen in the South were comfortable with. So, with the Cold War, with McCarthyism driving the fear of challenging the Cold War, the Legion versus the American Veterans Committee, most of the veterans move into the American Legion. That's a veterans group whose politics is extremely conservative, extremely pro-war, and very, unfortunately, racist. I mean, the Southern parts of the United States at a very difficult time in opening up American Legion halls. The Veterans Committee was another veterans group, which few people ever hear about, but the American Veterans Committee was the smaller veterans group, and it adhered to, and tried to adhere to, and sustain the ideals of the Popular Front. So the wartime ideals live on in sort of the veterans politics of the American Veterans Committee, but they do not in the more conservative, power-oriented, power of America and the rest of the world politics of the Cold War and of McCarthyism. That's a famous riot in Peekskill, New York. I could show you this in 1949. These are American veterans who fought the war for democratic principles, ostensibly now attacking a concert given by Paul Robeson, an African-American singer who's very far to the left, and Pete Seeger, another folk singer who's very pro-union, very pro-civil rights. And so that riot there is an example of how the veterans themselves, not just the Cold War leaders like McCarthy, are moving away from some of the aspirations that had framed their understanding of World War II when it was that they actually fought it. So, in 1954, the Americans put up, at that time, we have a national memorial in World War II now in Washington, they put up the Iwo Jima Memorial in Washington. That's a memorial to a Pacific battle. It's a battle in which 1/3 of all Marines in the United States were killed, over 2,000. 1/3 of all the Marines killed in World War II were killed on Iwo Jima. There's no sign of bloodshed. And one of the implications, as we move towards a sort of less democratic, more heroic and patriotic view of the war, which this memorial certainly is that we begin to talk less about the violence. We talk less about the bitter realities which are at the heart of novels like Jones and Mailer. I mean, there seems to be a connection, even with the celebration of the regeneration of good war, there's a connection between talking about war like that and an unwillingness to talk about war in terms of its sort of sordidness and its full scope of bitter realities. Now, what really interests me about Iwo Jima Memorial, the five guys, and there's some debate in the U.S. today about who those guys are that pose for the photo, but I'm going to show you two of them, and there's no debate about these guys. So the debates are about some other guys, whether they were sort of part of the memorial or not. So, Ira Hayes is in that. He posed for that photograph. He was a Native American. He was from Arizona. One of the things that really disturbed Hayes personally, and of course it's the personal story of the experience of the war that's hidden by the heroic monument memorial that he's in. He thought that the war would lead to better opportunities for Native Americans and signed reservations, not receiving much fair treatment. He thought things would be better, and it was clear to him within a year or two, three, that they were not. And well, this wasn't the only reason for his downfall, if you will. He was so bitterly disillusioned and suffering some traumatic stress syndrome himself that within months after the dedication of the Iwo Jima Memorial, which he attended in 1954, he was found dead in the Arizona desert. Victim of alcoholism, post-traumatic stress disorder, and extreme disillusionment over the fact that Native Americans didn't benefit from their sacrifice in the way that he thought they would. The other guy is Michael Strang. And again, there's a personal story of frustration behind their incorporation of these sort of their bodies within the memorial itself. Strang's father and his family were immigrants from just south of the High Tatras in Slovakia. They moved to Pennsylvania into a coal mining region. And in the late 30s, Strang joined the military because his mother and he thought that the military was the way out of their sort of destitute, working class, immigrant coal miner life. And the hope was that he would gain a career in the military to elevate the entire family. The family he was killed on Iwo Jima. After the war, there were many ceremonies in which his family was invited to. They simply couldn't go anymore. They couldn't even attempt to go to the Iwo Jima Memorial anymore. They couldn't buy into the simple patriotic explanation for the war when, in fact, their son was dead, and so was their dream of uplift. And so these men whose bodies are sort of fused in the copper and the bronze that's in the memorial really carried other personal stories that were much more sort of problematic and frustrating for them. So the heroic is sort of leading or tamping down the sort of frustration and cynicism that they had, and some writers that we looked at had as well. If you want to go to find memorials that are more about the suffering of World War II in terms of the U.S., you have to go to places like New Mexico. You don't get it in Washington. You don't get the graphic representation of suffering and death for World War II. You get it for Vietnam, etc. But in New Mexico, most of the soldiers that died in New Mexico were National Guardsmen that were trapped over there. They were joining the National Guard, figuring if there was a war, it would be in Europe. What happens? Pearl Harbor, they're trapped over in the Philippines, they're captured, they're taken POWs by the Japanese. Half of them never come back. And so New Mexico's monuments all over the state are all about the suffering veterans. They are not willing to abandon the simple grimness and death that they faced for any particular heroic version. It doesn't mean there are no patriotic heroic versions in New Mexico. It just means that the monuments took a different tenor, if you will, and presented a different perspective on the war itself, especially because of the sufferings of the POWs. The Tan Day, which they celebrate every year, they actually lower the American flag in front of the Capitol building in New Mexico and raise a white flag of surrender. I mean, we wouldn't do that at the National Mall in Washington, etc. But they have not been able to leave the sort of grim realities of the war behind for some more mythical perspective. One of my favorite writers from World War II is John Hersey, because he decides to try his hand on everything. You want the Popular Front, the war as a war for democracy. Read his novel, A Bell for Adano. American troops, when the Pulitzer Prize in 1940, American troops move into Italy, and what do they bring to this Italian village? Democracy. They travel to fascists, they bring in democracy, and it's a very sort of uplifting tale if you read it. But then, a few years later, he sneaks into Japan. You're not allowed to go in there and report McCarthy's running Japan, and he interviews victims at Hiroshima. And he publishes Hiroshima, which is a bestseller in the U.S. in '46, etc. And it's Japanese voices telling about the suffering and about the doctor sitting in the hospital and having the hospital blow away. And Americans are buying it like crazy. In fact, it's really interesting that you have this brief moment when Americans are looking at the carnage and questioning, to some extent, there are always something questioning, the atomic bombing in Japan. But in just 1949, once the Russians get the atomic bomb, it's very hard to be a dissenter in terms of how we look at World War II, because now the culture and politics is coalescing a much more patriotic, less democratic view. And when I'm finished today, I'll get to Poland. In 1948, John Hersey writes his famous novel, The Wall. And The Wall is about the Polish ghetto in Warsaw, and about the fight of resistance and brief uprising against the Nazis. And he sort of gives us, opens up to Americans something they're not looking at a great deal, and that is the situation of the Jews in Europe. Hersey was actually stationed with the Red Army for a while. So he's moving into Poland as the Red Army is moving into Poland. And he's observing this. He's coming through Warsaw, and he's writing The Wall, which becomes a bestseller in the United States. And again, but now we're back to a heroic view of the war. Here the heroes are the Jews, who fought against the Nazis to the extent they were able. And so he's got democracy, he's got the American violence in Japan, and he's got a tinge of heroicism as he looks at the Jews, and it's a very popular book. But what's really interesting about Hersey's The Wall is what the publishing industry and the reviewers make of it. And so what you know is the Holocaust, and what we know is the Holocaust, remember, I'll get to this in a second. When we talk about the Holocaust, nobody in the 40s was talking about the Holocaust, because that word wasn't used to apply to what we know to be the Holocaust at this particular time. So he's a book of the month called Selection. It's advertising as having a great heroic theme of the human spirit defiant and incomparable in the face of physical annihilation. Well, yes, you can get good out of bad all the time, but this is really a tip-off of where Americans are going to go when they begin to come to grips as a nation with the Holocaust. It's not going to be, in a sense, the full scope of its horror, but we'll get to that when it's ahead. Here's a review by a rabbi in North Carolina, and he feels the book shows man's nobility in the face of death. Now, that may be true, but it certainly suggests an unwillingness, which is also happening in the larger American society, to come to the war, all that involved the atomic bombings of the Holocaust in terms of the full grim realities. So the Holocaust, American officials know of the Holocaust. They know of the killing of the Jews. Some people know about it. There are things in the paper. Roosevelt during the war was warning the perpetrators of possible repercussions, etc. There's a lot of controversy today, which I don't have time to go into, about whether the Roosevelt and the U.S. State Department could have done more to save more Jews. We're happy to talk about that at another time. But Americans after 45 are starting to get photographs. In fact, the first visuals the American public is getting of the Holocaust are the newsreels. They're going to the movies. The reason everybody's going to the movies in the 40s is that everybody's working. There's nothing else to do. They're not making cars, they're not making TVs, they're not making that stuff, etc. So all you leisure time, all you do is go to the movies. Large cities have theaters running 24 hours a day, around the clock. So they're seeing the newsreels, so they're seeing the bones, they're seeing the bodies, they're seeing the horrors of the liberation of the camps. There's already news articles when the Russians are liberating camps like in Poland. That's already appearing in the American press, and the visuals are coming more after the liberation of many of the German camps. There's a lot in the press. There's a lot in the press in the late 40s, of course, of the Nuremberg trials, and that is certainly a rendition of what the Germans were doing and in the death camps. But basically, the discussion of the press, and even the film that comes out a number of years later on Nuremberg, is really about the majesty of the American justice system. Look what a great justice system we have compared to Nazi Germany, where, of course, there's no particular justice system at all. And so it's sort of, the Holocaust is seen in the most general way, not so much, and I know this seems like maybe not a sharp distinction, except it seems to be in American culture at the time. The Holocaust is seen mostly as a manifestation of German or Nazi evil, but it's not seen as a particular Jewish issue or Jewish problem. And I stress that because eventually it will, but not for what. And so the Holocaust is coming into American culture at a time when American culture is moving away from seeing the war in all its grim realities. Just like Mailer saw it, just like Hersey saw it. We're seeing the Holocaust, but we're seeing it as this manifestation of German evil and sort of German atrocities, and not particular a Jewish issue in the way that it would become. You don't get that, at least in America, in a significant way until after the Eichmann trial in 1961. Israel captured Adolf Eichmann, they put him on a trial, it became a global trial, everybody read about it, etc. There was testimony from camp survivors, and there were people reading out. They weren't reading this in the late 40s and 50s. They weren't getting the survivor testimony that became so indispensable to the eventual sort of creating of today what we know as the Holocaust. And after the Eichmann trial, you get a much more critical and deeper perspective in America and other countries as well. France is the same thing. France is running away from the Holocaust as fast as it can until the Eichmann trials, because of course de Gaulle wants to privilege primarily into a wartime story, the heroic resistance of the resistance in France. And he doesn't want to talk about the Holocaust in France because, of course, many French are collaborators in the whole enterprise. The first time the New York Times uses the term Holocaust is 1959. And look at the words that even American Jews are using in the late 40s. They're calling it Hitler's dark reign of terror, the great catastrophe. Again, they haven't come to sort of the conceptions and the terminology yet that we see today. And it's really only in the last few years that we've got the type of scholarship that tells us how American Jews were responding to this, etc. And we know that even though the larger American society was not overly invested in the Holocaust, it was not primarily seen as a destruction of the Jews, but more of a manifestation of German evil. In the American Jewish community, that was not true. They were clued in entirely, right from the beginning, about the substantial massacres, slaughters of the war, etc. And there's a lot going on. They're changing the curriculum in American Jewish schools in the 40s to make sure that the kids are studying this stuff. They're creating, the American Jewish Committee creates a certain ritual, say a ritual of remembrance, so that people collectively can remember the dead, the 6 million dead, as they would often refer to them. There's markers in Jewish cemeteries that are put there in the 40s in America, etc. There's no public memorials yet. We don't have a Holocaust museum yet, but the Jews are, you can see the terminology that American Jews are using in the late 40s, 6 million of our people destroyed by a tyrant more wicked than the Pharaoh. That was a design for a monument, a memorial, to the 6 million dead American Jews that was supposed to go in, or the plan was to put it in New York City in the early 1950s. It was never built. One of the reasons it was never built was because the officials thought it was, quote unquote, too Jewish. And too Jewish meant that that was something that people were not really comfortable with, but we were very sensitive by the early 50s of being, in a sense, condemning, talking about the Holocaust at least publicly, because we were also trying to entice Germany as a partner in terms of our foreign policy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The memorial, to the best you can make it out, to my left, that's really, if you can see it more clearly, a statue of Moses. And then there's these engravings of what's supposed to be the mass of humanity. And Moses is directing the mass of humanity to read the Ten Commandments. And that was the sort of aesthetics of what this was supposed to be about. Maybe that could have been built 20 or 30 years later, but I stress that it could not have been built, and was not built, in 1951 for the reasons I just said. I just said that, so I'm just repeating myself on the screen. The reference to the Rosenbergs was that it's a Cold War case. Ethnic Jewish Rosenbergs were spies from the Soviet Union. They were charged with giving the Russians the secret atomic bomb. Julius Rosenberg would not understand the secrets of the atomic bomb if they were put in his hand, because that's high-level theoretical physics. There were two Marxist British scientists who really delivered the real goods to the Soviets on that. But the Rosenbergs were involved in some low-level spying, and they were condemned to death. The judge said they had to die because they're responsible for all American deaths in Korea. Why Korea? Because the argument was that if we didn't give the secrets, you didn't give the secrets to the Russians, then the Russians wouldn't give the green light to the Chinese and North Koreans to invade South Korea, and there would be no Korean War, etc. So they got to die. But there's a huge debate over clemency worldwide. All right, if you leave them in jail, leave them in jail. They got two young kids, go kill the Rosenbergs. But the leading here is that it was really created a division within the American Jewish community. To be Jewish and American in the early 50s, then many of them felt the best public stance was to be 100% patriotic. And if you're 100% patriotic in the Cold War, you want to kill the Rosenbergs if they were not patriots. The other half of the American Jewish community was leftist, was Marxist, was pro-union, was highly sort of pro-racial equality. They were the popular front, very much the popular front. And so the American Jewish community gets split over this issue of the Rosenbergs. And of course, many of them have to abandon their old popular front loyalties because, in fact, that seems unpatriotic. I'm going to skip just a bit. I just want to talk a little bit about the Diary of Anne Frank. Many of you have read it. It's used in schools all over the world, etc. It was really popular in America. You might argue that in the 1950s, if Americans had a popular image of what the Holocaust was about, it was from the reading of the Diary of Anne Frank, the play in New York, which is very popular, and then, of course, the movie, which I think came out in 1959. And, of course, the thing that people like about it was that the Diary of Anne Frank, the story of Anne Frank, at least in the play, in the movie, and the book, stops before Bergen-Belsen, before she gets, and her sister died. Doesn't get to the concentration camp. So you can talk about the Holocaust without talking about the slaughter and the camps themselves, etc. And you can begin and see what you saw in some of the early responses to John Hersey's novel On the Wall, that this is a story that Anne Frank says, I believe all men are good, and the New York Times says about the film, it showed the magnificence of human endurance. We still were sort of really having a harder and harder time, in fact, moving away from the grim perspectives of the 40s of Jones and Hersey on the atomic bombings in America, and trying to find something noble, something that was so horrific. That's a poster for the play, The Diary of Anne Frank, in New York in 1855. The first version was rejected like the memorial because it was seen as too Jewish. Why? Because too much focus on the death of the Jews by implied was an implication of a critique of Germany. And in the Cold War era of McCarthyism, there were a lot of people who were very sensitive about that. I think it's really interesting. I don't know why I put this in there, except that I just found it so interesting. Otto Frank. Can you imagine Otto Frank? He is the father of Anne Frank. He's hiding out from the Nazis, during the war. He's there. He is in Hollywood in 1958, visiting the movie set of the movie they're trying to make for Anne Frank, and he can't watch it. He can't even watch them do it. I mean, Otto Frank is like Mailer going through Nagasaki or Hersey going through talking to Hiroshima advisors. They can't let go of the trauma. They are bearing witness to the horrors of the war, something that the larger culture was trying to navigate and find ways to sort of run away from it as in almost any way they could. We used to have lunch with the actors. I mean, I just think that's a sort of bizarre scene when Anne Frank's father, one of his two daughters died at Bergen Belsen, is now having a lunch with these actors who are producing this movie, which he can't watch. And we couldn't even see the play itself, because of course he sees what some of the people in the 40s saw, and that was this war raised real questions about human nature and about the horrors that it brought. So after the Ackman trial, you get more of a pronounced push to have a more critical appraisal throughout the world, and in the U.S., of the Holocaust. Now we've got the terminology starting to coalesce, if you will, and now we're getting more survivor testimony. Especially after the Eichmann trial, survivors in the U.S., for example, are now speaking up. They're being interviewed in the newspaper. People are getting a sort of an oral tradition or a report from the death camps of people who were there, and that's changing the perspective and moderating the sense that we're simply going to look at this sort of struggle for something noble and something horrific, and seeing the Holocaust for what it was, etc. And along with the Indiana delegation this morning, I had the privilege, and something I certainly wanted to see and did, of visiting the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, which was dedicated, as you know, in Warsaw here in 1948. And we'll come back to that at the end. But it's interesting, the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, at least the site facing the museum, is about these heroic Jewish defenders, etc. They're sort of heroes fighting, of course, against the evil of the Nazis, etc. But look at Rappaport, that is the guy who designs the 1948 memorial in Warsaw. Look at the memorial he designs for Philadelphia in 1964, after there's a greater sort of input of Jewish testimony, camp survivor testimony on the horrors, where people were beginning to see it for what it was, that aesthetically, that's supposed to be bodies engulfed in a flame, etc. And so there's no heroism. It's interesting that Rappaport, the same man that was here in Warsaw in 48, giving you that sort of heroic memorial, is giving you something less, that sort of somber memorial, same guy, in Philadelphia in 1964, called the Memorial to the 6 Million Martyrs. And I really found it interesting that it was Rappaport that did this, because I knew that Rappaport was the designer, the craftsman of the Warsaw Memorial. But as I poked around some more, I found Rappaport again. And I said that too quickly, and I'll come to it in a second. I'll say this real quick. The 1964 movie, The Pawnbroker, is also an extension or another example of this more close-up look, this more serious confrontation with the Holocaust, because it's a movie now that is about a camp survivor. Rod Steiger, the actor, he survived Auschwitz. He's now running a pawn shop in Brooklyn, and what bothers him is not only his flashbacks of the camp and his death of his family, but in fact the exploitation and racism he sees in the Bronx in New York. And if anyone ever thought of a way to bring back the Popular Front after the 40s, there it is. There's the pawnbroker telling you about the camps, the horror of the camps, and linking that violence to the racial violence in America. That's pure sort of Popular Front combined with an emerging recognition of what the Holocaust was about. When you've seen the movie, it's actually a great movie from my perspective in many ways. That's Steiger, of course, is haunted constantly by his experience at the camps. the losses of loved ones, and of course, his observation that America too, like Mailer, he's willing to make a critical perspective, put out a critical frame on America as well, in terms of its race problems, and of course, its failure to achieve intolerant goals of the Popular Front. Back to Rappaport. So now he's in 1985, and he's doing a memorial in New Jersey, and this one now is pure good war British generation. This is a supersized American soldier carrying a body from one of the camps. And this is, notice it was purposely aligned with the Statue of Liberty in the background, etc. And this is Rappaport now basically Americanizing the Holocaust. It doesn't dislodge the sort of bitter elements of it, but it sort of puts it within a more heroic, mythical view of Americans as liberators, etc. Probably liberators too. So Rappaport is in Warsaw 48 and heroic Jews. He's in Philadelphia in 64, bodies burning in the fire, total tragedy and trauma. And he is in New Jersey in 1985, now putting a good war Americanized version of the Holocaust for public consumption itself. Schindler's List does something of what the last Rappaport Memorial does. It goes to the war and it celebrates individual heroes. Schindler's not an American, but he's outsmarting the Nazis, of course, as you know, and saving Jews at the same time. But it's a Holocaust story that, again, is less about the Holocaust, like Anne Frank was in a sense, and more about the potential for individuals to become heroic. Doesn't mean that individuals can't do moral action, become heroic in terms of experiences of mass violence. It's just that that's what it happens to privilege, etc. And you've seen the movie. It's again a sort of an Americanized version of the Holocaust as an individual sort of achievement and the ability to outsmart the Nazis more than it is about the piles of bodies that they saw in newsreels. Just briefly, you know there's a U.S. Holocaust Museum now. I just want to mention it was dedicated in 1993. Some people say it's part of the creation of the self-idealizing American version of good war. I think it's more than that, but that's part of the critique. In many ways, it's a wonderful museum. I do want to mention that in the design and planning of that museum, there was some serious arguments between Polish Americans and Jewish Americans, because Polish Americans felt that the Holocaust Museum was not adequately depicting their suffering and sacrifice in Poland as well. I know that has been an issue in Poland, but I wanted you to know that it was also, it wasn't a major issue. It didn't rise to something, of utmost importance in getting the memorial museum done, but it was for a long time some serious stuff, and there is some now modest acknowledgement within the Holocaust Museum of Polish suffering as well. And so I'm at the end, and I'm back to the Warsaw Ghetto, where Rappaport studied his work. I had the chance to visit the Warsaw Uprising Memorial itself, and Poland too. It has various versions. It has various forms of monumentation of what the war was about. And Rappaport finally died, but I find him an interesting guy. He died in 1987. He went to Israel and did another World War II memorial called the Brotherhood of Man, which is sort of the universal idea of what the Four Freedoms was about in the first place. That we were fighting this war so that all people everywhere would have freedom of religion and speech and healthcare and jobs and freedom from political persecution. And so when I think about the muddled memory of World War II, I think about Rappaport. And where Rappaport is showing you the heroes, and where Rappaport is showing you the destruction, and where he's showing you the patriotic Americans, and where at the end of his life, he's back to where we started with Roosevelt and the Popular Front, and that's this universal dream for a better life and political rights for all men and women, everywhere, all the time. Thank you.